Hi everyone, welcome to Cyberside Chats. My name is Matt Dern. I'm the Director of Training and Research for LMG Security.
And I'm Sherry Davidoff, the founder of LMG Security.
And today we are going to be talking about hacked telecom companies and why that matters. So we found out a little while ago that there was a rash of telecom companies that had been hacked by what is assumed to be a nation-state Chinese actor called
Salt Typhoon.
Salt Typhoon. We'll talk about them here in just a minute. But this included some major names in the game. It was AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile, one of many hacks T-Mobile has suffered, Lumen Technologies, which used to be CenturyLink, Charter Communications. I mean, the list is significant.
Okay, when you first brought this up this morning, I was like, that makes me want to crawl into a hole.
Yeah,
because
you visibly yawned.
I know, I was like, yawn, what can we do about a telco getting hacked? And then the more we talked about it, the more I realized, number one, there's practical financial risks that can affect you if a telco gets hacked, which we'll talk about because of the social engineering implications. And then there's the risk of outages. And there are actually things that we can do to protect ourselves and to reduce the risk. And so we'll talk about that today.
Yeah, totally. In this case, we'll go over the timeline really quick just so everyone has kind of an idea of what we're talking about. This was a hack that was discovered in 2024, and it had lasted at that point, we think, between about 1 and 2 years.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah, it had been going on for a while before it was discovered. And again, this is a Chinese nation-state group called Salt Typhoon. And Salt Typhoon is kind of notorious for going after telecom companies. It's realistically what they do. So how do they get in? Because I really wanted to dig in and look at, like, if all these companies were hacked by the same group, were they hacked the same way? Was there some common thread?
Was it the same vulnerability?
Was it the same vulnerability?
Like an inside attack?
Yeah. No, as it turned out, it was a bunch of different things. A lot of it came down to unpatched hardware, and I know we've hammered on this a lot in both webinars and in other
software
Cyberside
exploits
Chats.
and third parties.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of Cisco devices are used by telecom companies, and a lot of Cisco devices have vulnerabilities. Now, for these devices, they had, in most cases, already been, or there was a patch already released that would fix that vulnerability, but a lot of them were kind of lagging behind. And that's kind of normal when we see telecom companies, because, I mean, if you look like AT&T, just recently they had a massive outage that was responsible for like millions of lost phone calls and pandemonium across the country because nobody could access the internet.
But they're so important. They've got to be totally patched and up to date on everything.
Right, except that if you roll a patch out in a big network like that and it bricks those devices, like, you've taken a communication system offline for the nation. That's kind of a big deal. So
do you think they're just scared to roll out patches?
Probably. I would be.
Yeah,
no, I'd be scared out of my mind.
Yeah.
But yeah,
another Microsoft-related outage.
That thing again. But no, they relied on unpatched vulnerabilities, and then they went with like traditional hacking techniques, so like credential stuffing attacks and just living off the land, and they ended up stealing a ton of information from all of these telcos.
Okay, and historically speaking, this is not the first time that major critical infrastructure has been hacked by China. It's kind of a thing, an ongoing thing. And it's interesting because it's part of this arms race, this ongoing arms race. Like, do you remember in 2013 when Snowden outed the U.S. and said the U.S. government is hacking Chinese mobile phone providers and undersea cables and infrastructure? And so it shouldn't be surprising that China, of course, is doing the same thing to us.
They're going to hack back.
And also Keith Alexander, who was the head of the NSA, said that China's hacking into U.S. organizations has resulted in the greatest wealth transfer in history because they have been stealing our intellectual property for decades.
Yeah, that makes
sense.
And they
started with like Titan Rain, that series of attacks on DoD contractors, and then they really brought into private enterprises and technology infrastructure like Operation Aurora, which we should probably talk about another day.
We should talk about another day. That's an entire podcast by itself.
Yes, okay.
Yeah. But yeah, in this case, they got out the door with some pretty significant data. So first and foremost, they got metadata for phone calls of millions and millions of people, and we'll go into that here in just a second.
Yawn.
But yeah, I know it
Just
sounds
kidding,
boring,
just
but
kidding.
it's impactful. They got like the geolocations though, so they that has like national security concerns, especially if we're talking about FBI agents or spies or someone like that. Yeah. And in some cases, they got the audio of phone calls, so that's big, especially since they were seemingly targeting like really high-profile people. They were going after like the Trump campaign, the Biden campaign. Like it was significant.
Okay, so let's say I'm like a mid-sized organization or somebody who is not like the Biden campaign or the Trump campaign. Even call metadata and geolocation data for mobile phones is pretty darn scary, right?
Yeah. It's a roadmap for everything your people are doing.
When we teach the Cyber First Responder class, we have a section about network flow records. Like, what do you get if you only know where some communication is coming from and where it's going to?
Yeah.
So on a personal level, somebody could know you're going to the doctor, you're going to the hospital, you're going to the bar, and there's a lot of inferences that can be made. But how does this apply to companies?
With companies, I mean, it could be the communications between your employees and somebody from another organization. You may see, data transfer going on. You may see things like, affairs happening inside the organization because people are talking to each other when they shouldn't. That's what we found out with Sony when they got hacked.
Right.
It wasn't metadata, it was email, but that same kind of implication was there.
Emails. My cousin, who runs a business, got a text recently from his bank, but it wasn't from his bank. It was actually a spoofed message that looked like it was from his bank. And of course, it was a hacker, and they followed up with a phone call, and they were trying to get his password to his company's online banking.
Right.
And one of the things we talked about was like, I wonder if they actually knew you banked, your company banked with this organization. And there's a few ways they could get that, but one of them is call metadata. If you or your finance team are calling a certain bank, then hey, hackers know that you do business with them, and they can then send follow-up specially crafted attacks that are faking your bank, for example.
Yeah.
And these days, even nation-state actors want to make money. We've definitely seen cases where nation-state actors are trying to commit fraud as well, or they'll sell this to other hacking groups that are trying to commit fraud.
Oh yeah, like North Korea is notorious for cryptocurrency fraud right now, and a lot of that comes down to mobile devices.
And Russian hackers as well are like, oh cool, we have an in, let's make some money off of this.
Yeah.
So I think we need to be prepared for the leaking of call metadata to result in some real dollars and cents losses to American companies and companies around the world that may have been impacted.
Well, and remember, I mean, it's not hard for a hacker to take your phone number and then link that to who you actually are. We saw that presentation at Black Hat a couple years ago with the researchers who did the usernames and passwords and then linked them all to personal phone numbers.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, it's not difficult to do.
No. The other major risk is outages, of course. And honestly, that's the thing that concerns me the most, because I'm very concerned about the loss of information and follow-on attacks and cyber espionage. But at the same time, outages can be absolutely devastating. And if nation-state actors have a foothold into all these different areas, what happens if our major telcos go down?
Especially if they go down like simultaneously.
Yeah. And do you remember I told you I teach at the Pacific Coast Banking School, and one of the banks that's a student there actually came into my cybersecurity class and told the class about how her bank was taken down completely offline for 60 hours. That's almost 3 days.
Yeah.
And it was because of a ransomware attack on their ISP. They weren't able to take phone calls. They weren't able to process transactions. They ended up resorting to taking pictures with phones. I think we talked about this on the last Cyberside Chats.
We did, yeah.
But it just shows you, like, if that was more widespread, that could be a huge issue, and it could go on and on and on. I mean, I don't know that that was necessarily the goal of the attackers, but it was certainly impactful.
I mean, it's definitely a possibility, though. I mean, if they have that kind of a foothold in that infrastructure and they decide to just, flip the off switch and take Charter Communications offline.
Oh my goodness.
That's
Verizon?
Or Verizon or AT&T. That's big.
Yeah. Do you remember the Russian attacks on the Texas water facility?
I do, yeah.
Yeah.
We had that in part of a webinar that we did, if I remember right.
Yeah, Russian hacktivists targeted a Texas water facility and made the pumps overflow. So again, we know that nation-state actors are trying to knock things offline. And in that case, it didn't seem super coordinated, but I really worry that as they're worming their way through our infrastructure, if they decide to pull the plug, they can.
They can.
And we can be resilient. Okay. I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, perfect. Well, so this is me being a little bit snarky, but I had to bring up the fact that T-Mobile was on this list.
Okay.
Because T-Mobile has been hacked like multiple times over the last few years.
I take it you're not a T-Mobile user?
I am not a T-Mobile user, and their bright pink signs kind of hurt my eyes when I walk by their kiosks, but that's a different thing. But just pointing out, I mean, they're one of the prime examples about how telcos are targets not just for nation-state actors, but for just regular hackers. I mean, they're constantly in the crosshairs. Like in 2021, they got hacked because they had an insecure gateway in their network that had no detections for brute force against it. And so a hacker was able to just spam SSH logins at it and steal the data for a few million of their people just by, gaining access with a username and password. And then they had like an exposed endpoint or an API in 2023. 37 million people's information went out the door.
They're a big telco. Shouldn't they have everything all buttoned up?
Well, that's what they're promising now. But
now that they've been fined $15 million by the FTC and $60 million by CFIUS,
And 350 million in the settlement for that 2021 hack.
Ooh, so, that's a little bigger.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, it goes to show too that these big, like too big to fail networks like T-Mobile and AT&T, I mean, they have their flaws just like everyone else, and a lot of times it just comes down to network security and patching.
Yeah, and I think what we're figuring out right now is that you can't necessarily rely on your third-party providers, even if they're really huge. Unfortunately, that just means that it'll affect a lot of people.
Yeah, widespread event.
Yeah. So did we talk about the Japanese telcos?
No, that was a new one.
Oh, that's like today they're talking about this.
That just came out. Yeah, there was a telco in Japan who was hacked, and 18,000 corporate customers were exposed in that hack. It was,
I thought it was interesting that this was specifically affected the corporate customers. So they got customer names, contact numbers, phone numbers, email. It didn't sound like so far that call metadata was exposed, but this is still a breaking story. And by the time you listen to this podcast, there might be more information about that.
Yeah.
So telco attacks are not going to stop. This is something that we have to keep expecting. In fact, you mentioned earlier, like a half hour ago, that when T-Mobile was hacked, what was it, the second or third time?
The 2023 hack,
Yeah, they were probably also hacked by Salt Typhoon, but they didn't know it.
At the same time, but didn't catch that one and didn't realize that they'd probably been hacked by two people simultaneously.
Right, or more, just to bring it full circle, though.
Yeah.
So, the question is, what telco hacks are happening right now that we're going to find out about in 6 months or a year? And hopefully we'll find out about that gently and not when our infrastructure goes down.
Ideally, yeah.
So let's jump into our takeaways for you guys. There are things we can do to reduce our risk. And I think number one for me was strengthen authentication for financial transactions. And I know, what does leaking of call metadata have to do with financial transactions? Well, again, if your call metadata is leaked, then hackers gain important information that can help them to social engineer your organization. And definitely your financial team is very high on their target list. So strengthen the authentication for financial transactions and just be aware. Don't rely on the phone, and that call metadata has been leaked. Not that it can be leaked, it has been leaked.
Yeah. We also want to make sure that staff understands that you can't trust a phone number. We talk about this one all the time.
Huge.
Spoofing or caller ID. Or caller ID, yeah. Spoofing a phone number is trivial. I mean, it's an easy thing to do, and if I'm a hacker and I know your call history and I know who you're talking to, who you normally get like your calls in from your bank or something like that, I can just spoof that phone number and look like that person. It makes it a lot easier for me to fool you, basically. So again, verify when you get requests like that over the phone.
I feel like we have a lot of security debt right now because this reminds me, the issue with the telcos reminds me a lot of the issue with credit card companies, where you can't retrofit the telephone networks and make them secure so that you can authenticate phone numbers. We want to, but it's unlikely to happen anytime soon. And similarly, like credit card numbers, you have to give them away all the time in order to use them. There's a fundamental insecurity in the system that everyone should be aware of.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, speaking of that, I mean, you lead us right into the next takeaway, and that's
perfect.
Limiting of information. Make sure that your staff, your employees understand that, I mean, phones are notoriously insecure. Text messages are oftentimes unencrypted. In fact, most of the time they are. There are ways that attackers can intercept text messages using like the Signal System 7 systems and a bunch of other things like that. But just make sure that if you're exchanging sensitive information, I mean, use an encrypted chat client. Use something like Signal to do that, as opposed to using just regular text messaging.
There's definitely organizations that use Signal and other messaging services or encrypted phone services to exchange sensitive information. So that's a good point.
Yeah.
But you want to make sure you're doing your due diligence on third-party vendors, of course. And as a society, we need to be requiring telco vendors and service providers to disclose their security practices and past breaches. And if you have the opportunity to vet different telecommunications companies, maybe you're rolling out new phones to employees or something like that, consider past breaches or current security practices as one of the factors that you take into consideration.
Yeah. And then, finally, have a backup plan.
Absolutely.
Yeah. If your telco goes down, or if you decide that you can't trust them, you need to have another way of establishing your communications. And having that planned out ahead of time is way better than doing it in kind of a hair on fire moment if you finally realize there's a problem somewhere.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Well, thank you guys so much for tuning in to Cyberside Chats. It's been fun talking about hacking of telecommunications companies and the things we can do about it. My name is Sherry Davidoff.
I'm Matt Duran.
And tune in next week for our next episode. Thanks so much.